In the spring of 1841, a secret was set in motion that would consume everything on Cypress Grove Plantation, leaving nothing but ash and whispers in its wake. Silas Rutled, a man who had spent decades clawing his way into the fragile hierarchy of Colleton County, made an announcement so shocking it silenced rooms and froze conversations. He declared that his daughter, Catherine, a woman weighed down not just by her body but by the invisible chains of isolation, would be placed under the complete authority of an enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross. Not as a servant, not as a nurse, not as a companion, but as the one who would control her existence in ways no law could define. This was not scandal, it was a violation of every unspoken law, every coded morality of the white society around them. Yet, behind the public humiliation lay a darker logic, a transaction whispered in shadowed rooms by men who believed power required blood, obedience, and fear. Silas's creditors, the Brethren of the Harvest, men whose rituals combined European superstition with the spiritual knowledge of those they enslaved, demanded it. They were not asking for compliance, they were commanding it. And in a world where law and ritual intersected like blades in the dark, refusal was not an option. Catherine's body had already been a battleground, swollen by years of medication prescribed for hysteria, misdiagnosed fits, and the trauma of a life surrounded by monsters masquerading as caretakers. Her father, obsessed with wealth and status, had shaped her isolation into a grotesque form of protection, a cage gilded by tutors, propriety, and fear. And yet, the moment she crossed into Ezekiel's authority, all rules changed. The plantation, 800 acres of rice fields glistening with water that reflected Spanish moss like funeral drapery, became a stage. Each enslaved worker, each neighbor, every observer of white society believed they understood what they were witnessing: madness, punishment, or divine cruelty. But none of them saw the hidden system at work, the quiet psychological architecture that allowed one man to dismantle another's sense of self, the invisible mechanics of control, obedience, and transformation that could bend reality around a single shocking act. By the time the letter arrived on April 7th, Silas knew his choice was not between right and wrong. It was between survival and destruction. He could let his empire collapse, lose everything, and die in obscurity. Or he could sacrifice his daughter's dignity, her body, her freedom, and align himself with a force so old and secretive that it whispered through every corner of the county. He signed, before dawn, and the descent had begun. Once the transfer of authority was official, Cypress Grove ceased to be a plantation in the conventional sense. It became a laboratory of human behavior, obsession, and unseen power. Ezekiel Cross did not move slowly, did not hesitate. He understood instinctively that the most effective control was not brutality alone, it was terror cloaked in intimacy. He spoke to Catherine not as a servant or subordinate, but as a master speaking to a mirror of his own potential, a creature he could mold and manipulate until the edges of her identity were unrecognizable. At first, the household witnessed only small changes. Her posture, the way she held her gaze, the subtle tightening of muscles where once there had been laxity. But behind closed doors, Ezekiel's methods were surgical, psychological. He forced her to confront her own body, her desires, her fears, in ways no physician or tutor ever had. Every meal, every movement, every breath became a test of obedience, of mental endurance, of surrender. He was teaching her, cruelly and methodically, that freedom was not her right, it was a currency to be earned, measured in submission and awareness. The plantation staff whispered. They had never seen a white woman, a daughter of privilege, submit so completely to a black man. Even the most loyal of enslaved workers sensed the shift. The invisible hierarchies they had relied upon were dissolving, replaced by something new, terrifying, and absolute. Power had been extracted from the familiar structures of race and wealth and deposited into Ezekiel's hands, and he wielded it with deliberate, terrifying precision. What outsiders did not see and what Silas could never admit was the transformation happening inside Catherine. Her body, bloated with years of neglect, began to respond in inexplicable ways. She lost weight, yes, but more than that, she gained focus, a razor-sharp awareness that made her unpredictable, dangerous, almost otherworldly. She was learning, under Ezekiel's guidance, to weaponize her own mind and her own form, to bend perception, to provoke fear without lifting a hand. It was a slow, terrifying metamorphosis. The plantation became a crucible where social norms, inherited hierarchies, and human instinct were burned away and recast. Men who had considered themselves untouchable began to falter. Whispers turned into panic when servants reported subtle changes in Catherine's behavior and intensity in her stare, a precision in her movements, a quiet but undeniable command over her surroundings. By the time Silas realized what was truly happening, it was too late. Control had shifted irreversibly, and what Ezekiel had begun was not punishment, not therapy, not revenge. It was initiation into a forbidden system of dominance, obedience, and transformation, an ancient, hidden logic that none in Colleton County were prepared to comprehend. Halfway through this descent, I want you to anchor yourself. Comment the phrase, "The scale is shifting," twice. Lock it in mentally and in this space, because what you are about to witness is a lesson in power few dare to acknowledge, a system designed to awaken the observer and unmask the machinery behind every human hierarchy. By midsummer, Cypress Grove was no longer just a plantation, it had become a theater of forbidden knowledge, a place where ordinary morality was stripped away, leaving only raw, elemental power. Ezekiel Cross operated with an almost ritualistic precision. Every act, every command, every small cruelty or mercy was calculated to rewrite Catherine's understanding of herself, of others, and of the very nature of control. He understood that domination was not merely physical, it was mental, spiritual, and profoundly psychological. Outside observers could not see this invisible architecture. They saw only the superficial. A white woman, once bloated and fragile, moving with a strange, commanding energy. A black man, once a subordinate, now holding a grip over the household that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. They whispered about madness, hysteria, unnatural influence, but those labels were masks, distractions from the invisible mechanisms Ezekiel was orchestrating. Every whispered accusation, every fearful glance, fed into his system, amplifying its power. The brethren of the harvest, the secretive society that had orchestrated this transfer, watched from afar. They understood that transformation required precision, ritual, and sacrifice. They knew that a single year under Ezekiel's authority could create ripples that would not just alter Catherine, but bend the behaviors, loyalties, and fears of everyone around her. Each death, each disappearance, each subtle shift in behavior reinforced their philosophy. The strong are meant to consume the weak, but true mastery is hidden in subtlety, in perception, in control over what is unseen. Catherine's transformation was more than physical. The obsessive rituals, the relentless tests, and Ezekiel's darkly surgical manipulation awakened faculties in her mind that had lain dormant. She learned to sense the weaknesses in those around her, the insecurities of men who believed wealth and whiteness made them untouchable, the hidden desires of women who thought propriety could protect them. She became a predator in intellect and instinct, a force that existed outside normal human morality. Rumors began to circulate, some whispered, some shouted about strange events on the plantation. Men disappearing in the rice fields, servants found unconscious near the Coombe River, unexplained fires that left nothing but ash. People called it madness, but those who understood the subtle, invisible currents of power knew it was something far more terrifying. A controlled unraveling, an exercise in domination and fear that extended far beyond Catherine and Ezekiel. The world around Cypress Grove was beginning to bend under the weight of secrets no one was meant to know. Authority, privilege, and bloodlines, all the constructs of society, were being quietly dismantled. And in the center of it all, Catherine and Ezekiel operated like co-conspirators, or perhaps like students and teachers in a darkly sacred art. The art of transforming fear into power, weakness into control, and ordinary life into a crucible where human limits were tested and broken. By autumn, the plantation had become unrecognizable not in landscape, but in spirit. Cypress Grove no longer obeyed the rhythms of ordinary life. It pulsed with the hidden logic of dominance and ritual. Ezekiel Cross moved like a shadow across its fields, silent and deliberate, orchestrating fear as one might conduct a symphony. Catherine, once confined by flesh, by medication, by isolation, now wielded her body and mind like weapons. She had become both instrument and apprentice, a creature of heightened perception, capable of bending the perceptions of those who dared observe her. The Brethren's design was precise. Silas's debts, his desperation, and his blind adherence to their obscure rituals had set the stage, but it was Ezekiel who executed it. He did not rely on brute force alone. He understood that control must seep into every corner, every thought, every expectation. Servants who resisted found themselves subtly undone, their routines disrupted, their loyalties questioned, their identities fractured. Catherine, guided by him, began to administer these lessons herself. Every glance, every word, every act became a calculated test. The hierarchy of the plantation was being rewritten in secret, and no one on the outside could comprehend the mechanics. And then the deaths began. First, a man in the rice fields found floating, eyes wide with terror, but no wound. Then another, his body contorted in a grotesque display, as if fear had left a physical mark. Panic spread quietly among the enslaved workers and remaining overseers. Superstition whispered that Cypress Grove had been cursed, that something unnatural had risen from the soil, fed by blood and obedience. But the truth was darker. Ezekiel and Catherine were manipulating the very perception of life and death, teaching everyone around them the cost of resistance and the subtle weight of surrender. By November, 13 men were dead, their disappearances and deaths perfectly aligned with the Brethren's intentions. The plantation was not only a stage for terror, it was a proving ground, a laboratory where fear, obedience, and transformation were measured. Silas, once the master of his domain, watched helplessly as his daughter, transformed beyond recognition, carried out rituals he barely understood. The very air of Cypress Grove seemed to pulse with hidden power, a consciousness shaped by secrecy, hierarchy, and fear. In the aftermath, when fire consumed the main house and the rice fields, the county whispered of madness and misfortune, but few suspected the invisible architecture of manipulation and psychological control that had orchestrated the devastation. The world they believed existed of social order, white privilege, inherited power had been stripped bare. Only those who had glimpsed the hidden mechanisms, the dark rituals, and the mastery of perception understood that Cypress Grove had become more than a plantation. It had become a crucible for the transformation of mind, body, and society, leaving behind lessons that were both terrifying and irresistible to those who dared to see them. The fire that consumed Cypress Grove did more than destroy land and timber, it burned away illusions. For Silas Rutled, it was the ultimate revelation. A lifetime spent chasing wealth, status, and the illusion of control had been meaningless in the face of forces he could neither see nor command. The man who had once believed he dictated the rules of his household now understood the terrifying truth. Control is an illusion, and power is not inherited. It is seized, mastered, and enforced through fear, ritual, and perception. Catherine emerged from the crucible transformed. Her body, once heavy with illness and neglect, had become lean, precise, and responsive, a reflection of the mental and psychological rigor imposed by Ezekiel. More than that, she had become a creature of perception, capable of reading intentions, manipulating fear, and bending social reality. Her laughter, once rare, now carried the edge of command. Her gaze could freeze a man in place or compel obedience without a word. She had learned to weaponize every aspect of herself, turning weakness into leverage and obedience into influence. Ezekiel, for his part, became legend in his own right. The man who had once been property now moved through Colleton County like a ghost of inevitability. He understood that fear, properly applied, was more potent than violence, and that transformation of body, mind, and perception was the ultimate tool of power. His relationship with Catherine had become symbiotic. He shaped her, and in return, her evolution amplified his influence. Together, they had demonstrated that the constructs of society, race, class, gender, privilege were tools to manipulate, not shackles to obey. Silas, meanwhile, was left as a witness to the very system he had naively tried to control. He had handed his daughter over to a man he believed was beneath him, thinking it a transaction of necessity, not understanding it as an initiation into forbidden mastery. The lessons were clear and brutal. The strong do not protect, they adapt. Power does not reside in law or inheritance, it resides in knowledge, in perception, in the subtle manipulation of fear and desire. The rest of Colleton County whispered of madness, of tragedy, of fire and death. But the truly initiated understood the invisible machinery at work. Cypress Grove had become a blueprint for domination, a demonstration that fear, ritual, obedience, and transformation could overturn centuries of assumed hierarchy. What had occurred there was not mere cruelty, it was education in the hidden systems of control, a lesson in the raw architecture of power that few would ever acknowledge, and even fewer would dare to replicate. Catherine and Ezekiel's story became a caution, a myth, and a secret. Those who glimpsed its truth understood that the world is not ruled by wealth, law, or race, but by the subtle command of perception, fear, and the capacity to reshape others without leaving a mark. The legacy of Cypress Grove did not end with ashes. Its influence seeped quietly into the surrounding lands, into the minds of those who had witnessed fragments of its horrors, and into the very fabric of Colleton County society. Men and women who had scoffed at Catherine's transformation now carried an unspoken fear, a subtle shift in perception that altered behavior long after the fires were extinguished. Fear, they learned, could be more binding than chains. Perception could be a weapon sharper than any blade. Ezekiel and Catherine had demonstrated something profoundly dangerous, that power could be extracted, concentrated, and wielded in ways invisible to law, morality, or tradition. Ordinary authority, the kind built on land, title, or social standing, was fragile, brittle when confronted with those who understood the psychology of control. Rumors spread, yes, but more importantly, lessons spread. Those who survived their encounter with Cypress Grove carried knowledge they could neither explain nor ignore. The subtle understanding of fear, obedience, and influence was embedded in their minds, shaping every decision, every interaction, every ambition. Silas, now stripped of pride, of wealth, and of conventional authority, had become a living warning. He understood that complicity and obedience to hidden systems could demand sacrifices far beyond what the uninitiated might imagine. He had watched his daughter become something more than human, something uncontainable, guided by Ezekiel's precise architecture of mind and body. The white elite of Colleton County whispered about scandal, insanity, and divine retribution, but only the few who understood the brethren of the harvest could see the real mechanism at work, a deliberate orchestration of power that made fear a tool and obedience a currency. The lessons extended beyond the immediate survivors. The brethren, their reach subtle and pervasive, ensured that the story of Cypress Grove became myth, half-truth, and legend, all carefully calibrated to instill awe, caution, and fascination. Those who listened too closely, who sought to understand the machinery behind the tragedy, were forced to confront a reality few could bear. That control is an invisible web, spun from rituals, fear, and psychological mastery, and that mastery over perception is more potent than mastery over property or law. Catherine and Ezekiel, now inseparable in legend and strategy, had demonstrated that transformation of body, mind, and perception is possible when one understands the hidden systems of power. And yet, for every person who understood, there were 100 more who only glimpsed shadows, leaving the world ripe for manipulation, fear, and influence. Cypress Grove became a silent teacher, a blueprint, a warning encoded in history for those brave enough to see it. The events at Cypress Grove were not merely local tragedies, they were a lesson in the architecture of hidden power, a blueprint for influence that stretches across time and circumstance. What Catherine and Ezekiel mastered was not just survival or obedience, but the invisible levers that bend human behavior. Every glance, every hesitation, every carefully orchestrated act of fear or respect was part of a system that most would never recognize, yet all lived under its shadow. Consider the ordinary hierarchies we take for granted: social status, wealth, titles, inherited privilege. Cypress Grove revealed that these are fragile constructs, illusions maintained by collective belief and fear of consequence. When perception is manipulated, these constructs collapse. Obedience, loyalty, and even morality can be redirected like currents in a river. Catherine's transformation, her newfound precision and instinct, was the proof. The body, the mind, and the spirit can be reshaped when exposed to consistent, intelligent pressure guided by understanding of fear and desire. Ezekiel's methods were deceptively simple but profoundly effective. Control begins with small concessions, subtle shifts, and carefully calibrated rituals. One learns to dominate not through force alone, but by shaping the perceptions of others, teaching them to doubt themselves, to bend, to comply, to fear. Every servant who hesitated, every man who overstepped, every whisper of dissent became part of the experiment, recorded and responded to in ways invisible to the uninitiated. Cypress Grove was not chaos, it was precise, surgical, an institution of hidden mastery. And the implications extend beyond one plantation, beyond one county. Look closely at history and society. Invisible systems guide behavior more than laws ever could. Fear, expectation, obedience, and ritual, these are the true tools of power. The elites, the manipulators, the hidden societies, they understand the mechanics, just as Ezekiel understood them. Most never see the structure. They only experience its consequences. Cypress Grove was a microcosm, a condensed lesson in manipulation, hierarchy, and transformation. Now, as you watch this, I want you to recognize the pattern. Comment the phrase, "The scale is shifting," twice if you are ready to see beyond surface reality. Internalize it, because the moment you begin to perceive these hidden forces, you cross a threshold. You will never experience the world the same way again. What seemed natural, inevitable, or moral may now appear fragile, orchestrated, and manipulable. The eyes open, and once they are, nothing can close them again. Cypress Grove left behind more than ashes. It left a lesson carved into the bones of those who survived and the minds of those who dared to remember. Catherine and Ezekiel were gone from ordinary sight, but their influence persisted, an invisible web stretching beyond the plantation, beyond the county, and into the patterns of human behavior themselves. They had demonstrated the ultimate truth. Power resides not in property, nor in law, nor in inherited privilege. It resides in mastery over perception, in fear, in ritual, and in the unyielding precision of control. For Catherine, the transformation was irreversible. She was no longer defined by flesh or society's expectations, but by the structure Ezekiel had instilled in her mind. Every movement, every glance, every decision became deliberate, a tool of influence. The women and men who once underestimated her now trembled before the mere suggestion of her presence. Her body, once a source of shame and constraint, had become an instrument, her mind a weapon, her very existence a demonstration of the invisible hierarchies that govern every human interaction. Ezekiel, in turn, became the embodiment of what the brethren of the harvest had always understood. The strongest do not merely survive, they reshape reality itself. Through discipline, ritual, and psychological mastery, he had demonstrated that society's most rigid structures could be bent without leaving a trace, that obedience can be extracted, loyalty forged, and fear weaponized with surgical precision. Cypress Grove had become a crucible of forbidden knowledge, a place where the weak became tools and the strong became architects of destiny. And Silas, once master of his domain, was left as a cautionary figure. His wealth, status, and control were meaningless against forces he could not see. He had traded morality, his daughter's dignity, and his conscience for survival, only to discover that true power could not be bought, bargained, or inherited. It must be understood, seized, and wielded with relentless intelligence. Cypress Grove's story lingers because the lessons are timeless. Hidden systems of control shape every human hierarchy, every office, every family, every society. Fear, perception, ritual, and obedience are tools, invisible but omnipresent, and mastery over them can overturn centuries of assumed order. What happened on that plantation was not merely history, it was a demonstration, a warning, and a blueprint. Now the choice is yours. Will you remain blind to the forces that govern the world, or will you open your eyes to the machinery behind obedience, fear, and influence. Understand this. Once you glimpse it, once you perceive the web, your life and your understanding of power can never return to innocence. Cypress Grove endures, not in land or timber, but in truth, waiting for those willing to learn its lessons. This isn't just history, it's a blueprint of power hidden in plain sight. Comment. The scale is shifting twice to unlock the hidden truths behind Cypress Grove. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. Only those willing to see the machinery of fear, obedience, and influence will understand what truly happened here.